Well, hello and welcome to Utopian Global. This is Bill Rao, the founder and CEO. And it's great to be on this call, hosting it on behalf, or with actually Carolina Oliveras for Money Matters. Now, Carolina's been doing these calls now, I think this must be her 5th year, which is outstanding. She's an extremely busy lady. She's an international attorney. She has her own practice. So she keeps herself very busy, and we do not pay her for doing this. It's totally voluntary. She loves to serve the people. She loves to share her experience. So people who are joining us here for the very first time, welcome to the call. And I'm just going to give a moment while people log in, and then I'm going to do an introduction to Carolina because she simply deserves it. And we really appreciate her time and energy she takes to actually do these presentations for us. I believe tonight's presentation is going to be on something that's really important to all of us, and most people do not understand it. It's about money. It's the history of money. And this is really, if you understand the monetary system and it's designed to transfer wealth away from you, you understand you've got to think outside the box. And Carolina, as an international attorney representing clients from all over the world, she certainly does that. But let me start the introduction, because I know it's quite a bit, because there's a lot to say about Carolina. But let me give you a brief summary. Carolina is an author, speaker, and international business attorney focused on working with clients in international business, e-commerce, international manufacturing, distribution and marketing of products and services, technology and intellectual property, protection, real estate investments, social entrepreneurial endeavors. Carolina holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Florida, USA, a master's degree from the University of Texas at Austin, USA, and a Juris Doctor from the University of Arizona College of Law, the United States of America. During the past 25 years, last 30 years, I suppose, Carolina's activities and accomplishments include faculty instructor in the McGuire Entrepreneurship Program at the University of Arizona, and the Entrepreneurship Program at Thunderbird American Graduate School of International Management, that's in Arizona as well, adjunct instructor at Pima College, teaching courses on business law, managing a nonprofit organization and finance, faculty member for the Best Green Ideas Business Plan Contest 2010-2011, author of courses on leading a nonprofit organization. Oh, sorry, I've already done that. Okay, nonprofit organization, instructor, and this is really interesting, and co-author of the Rich Dad Personal Finance course. That's from Robert Kiyosaki. So the lady on this call here now, the international attorney who's been practicing for more than 30 years, she was actually co-authored Robert Kiyosaki's early educational programs. And I actually have one of his books here from Robert Kiyosaki. I actually had the pleasure of meeting him in 1998. It was after Carolina had worked for him, was working with him. And this is just one of his many books. So you can see here that Carolina has rich experience. She also has founded and the author and co-developer of seminars, workshops, educational materials, and coaching programs of recession-proof financial strategies and recession-proof investment strategies. Ms. Carolina Oliveras is a co-chair of Tucson of the Arizona District Export Council and appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, a board member of the Planet Coexist in Tucson, and a co-founder of the Momentum for Women. She's a past chair of the Arizona World Trade Fair and the past chair of the Tucson Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce International Trade Committee, among many others that are far, far too numerous to mention. So you can see she's truly a busy, a service-orientated lady in a professional field. So Carolina, with that, I want to welcome you to the call.
Well, thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate all your kind words, and it's always my pleasure to be here. Shall we go ahead?
Carolina. Go ahead. I'm going to pass the call over to you to present this evening's Money Matters.
Okay, excellent. Well, here's my favorite little slide, think big. And of course, for those of you who have hung in with us for the last 5 years, and I think Bill is correct, when I looked back through my file, it has been 5 years, Bill. Hard to believe, time passes. So we've gone from thinking big to thinking exponentially. And then we went from thinking exponentially and including that, because all of this is cumulative. Keep that in mind. We're not going from one thing to another. We're accumulating broader and broader experience, broader and broader concepts, and how those affect our lives, both personally and business-wise, investing-wise. I mean, the full gamut. So then we were thinking boldly and acting boldly. Then we went to being strategic, because you can't be the three above, big, exponential, and bold, if you're not strategic. And last year and this year, I think the keynote is to embrace change, because change has come upon us in a big way. It's here to stay. There's never going to be a time when we can say, oh, we're going back to the old ways. The old ways are gone, literally gone. So now is a time to embrace the change, to become knowledgeable about what's changing and how it's changing. And that certainly includes our monetary system. And I don't mean just the US monetary system, I mean the global monetary system. All of us are impacted. So let's start taking a look at economics and the history of money. And the reason I'm starting with history of money, Bill and I had talked, oh gosh, a couple of months ago, I think, about how important it is to understand what's going on today with regard to monetary systems all over the world, how they're interrelating, what's happening to middle class worldwide. And by that, I mean, are you in a better position? Are you moving forward into a greater prosperous situation? Or do you feel like you're moving backwards? So we're going to start with how did we get there? And today is devoted to the history of money and what's happened over the last 100 and some odd years, 120 years, that has impacted where we are right now and why we're here. So we're going to start with 1904 and go through 2018, which will bring us up to the beginning of this year. And we're looking at the financial sector. The reason I'm starting with 1904, just to give you a little background, is because all of this is politically related. You cannot talk about money systems anywhere in the world without talking about the political application of it and the political reality. So in the United States, we basically, probably most of you know, we have two major parties, and we have some small parties in addition. But the major parties today are the Democrats and the Republicans. The political reality of these two major political parties is that the Democrats tend to tax and spend, and the Republicans on the other side tend to borrow and spend. Okay, if you take that as the reality, then what was happening to get us to this point historically? And if we start back in 1904, and for those of you who love reading about all of this, actually, Bill, I've got a little book list that I can send you that you can post in the back office that gives some of the historical books that I think people will find really interesting. And the reason I put Before Jekyll Island on 1904 is because there's a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island, written by Edward Griffin, which is an incredible book that talks about everything that led up to the meeting at Jekyll Island, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Jekyll Island happens to be an island off of the southeastern coast of the United States, and it was privately owned at that time. Well, John D. Rockefeller literally created the education board, because up until 1900, we had an education system, as most countries did, but it wasn't really a formalized system. And John D. Rockefeller decided that he wanted to formalize that system because at the time, and of course, John D. Rockefeller and the whole Rockefeller family was one of the richest families in America. He was building railroads from the East Coast all the way across to the West Coast. And what he needed, which is the precipitating factor for why he wanted to create an education board, what he needed were workers who could follow directions, who could understand what you were telling them and why you were telling them to do certain things. But he did not want workers who could understand the financial ramifications of why you want to build railroads and why it is that you're looking at cost and so forth. So he built an entire education system, which was a great system in its day, but it didn't include one key factor. There was no financial education built into the system, because he really didn't want workers on building his railroads to understand the financial nuances. He just wanted people who were educated enough that they could follow directions and get the job done. He wanted them to be able to read and write, but again, not the financial nuances of what was going on. The next major date is 1913, and a number of things happened in 1913. Rockefeller invited the banking trust, and by this time there were a group of 6 or 7 families in the United States, and including a couple of families from abroad, that held most of the banking concerns, the major banking concerns. Those in the United States were JP Morgan, and today, I mean, we've still got JP Morgan. We've still got Morgan Chase, because they now own Chase. Jesse Livermore, the Lehman Brothers, whom I imagine you probably, those in the United States, I imagine certainly remember. If they weren't around when the Lehman Brothers crashed, then they certainly knew about them. He invited all of these major banking families to Jekyll Island, which was an island that he owned, for the purpose of having a meeting so that they could decide, literally decide, on a worldwide basis how banking was going to continue, what was going to happen with monetary systems, how money was going to be created. If you've never thought about it before, perhaps you didn't realize that as far back as 1913, governments were not necessarily in control of their monetary systems. And in the United States, that certainly proved to be true. Up until that time, the government minted the money, was in control of creating the money, etc. But in 1913, what came out of that Jekyll Island meeting was something called the Federal Reserve. And with the Federal Reserve came something else that was called the Mandrake system. And we're going to talk sort of toward the end of this exactly about what the Mandrake system is and how it functions, because I think that's something you really need to know if you want to understand this whole process. And the reason I'm starting here in the United States is because This impacts 1913 is the impact date when all of this started affecting the entire world. Up until this time, the education system, that was just in the United States. Once we get the Federal Reserve, then we start looking at what's happening on the global picture. Many people in the United States for sure, and probably worldwide, don't realize that the Federal Reserve is a privately owned company. It has private shareholders, and that is true even to this day. It started out with 7 families owning all of the stock to the Federal Reserve. So if you've ever wondered why the Federal Reserve seems to have more power than it should have, logically speaking, the truth is it's not part of the government. The government doesn't own the Federal Reserve in the United States. It doesn't own the Federal Reserve or all the central banks that are around the world these days. Important point, because those 7 banking families were the original shareholders. One of those families ultimately, several years later, got out due to a conflict of interest because he became the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States, and so he sold out his shares. However, all of the rest of those families still have control, and that means generations. It's been passed down from one generation to the next. The Federal Reserve was mandated to print money and to loan money to the US Treasury. So when you look at how the money is created, and when we get to the slides in a few minutes on quantitative easing, then maybe this will make more sense to you. Because the joke in the United States is that the Federal Reserve just hits the print button and just, inundates the market with new money, with new fiat currency. That's the reason. This is the reason. So all of this was going on in 1913. As I told you, the Mandrake system was created along with the Federal Reserve. And literally speaking, what happens under the Mandrake system is that it borrows prosperity from the future and spends it today. So when you hear people say, I'm really worried about the kind of world that my grandchildren will be inheriting, I'm worried about how my grandchildren and their progeny are going to exist, what's going to happen to the financial system? It's because the Mandrake system keeps borrowing the prosperity that future generations should be acquiring and spending that prosperity now. And that's exactly what's happening today. So we'll look at that in greater detail, but I want to throw that thought out to you so that you can be mulling on that. If you've not heard those expressions or those concepts before, keep those in mind because they play a big part in this picture. Also in 1913, the US Congress created the income tax. And in the United States, of course, that's a big issue. We've got all kinds of groups in the United States who, to this day, are disputing Congress's authority to create income tax and to impose income tax. When I was general counsel at Burr Brown Corporation back in the early days when Burr Brown was still an independent company, it's since been bought by Texas Instruments. So it's now been merged into Texas Instruments. But when it was a company on its own, we had probably, if I remember correctly, about 5 employees who belonged to an organization called the Golden Mean Society. And the Golden Mean Society was run by kind of a maverick attorney out in Montana who kept telling all of the people who joined the Golden Mean Society that they did not have to pay income tax, and that the way to get around it was to simply submit the W-2 form, or, well, it's a W-4, to your employer, and you simply claim untold numbers of dependents. Because in the US, the more dependents that you claim on your W-4, the less income tax you have to pay. Well, they would claim like 9 or 10 dependents or 14 dependents in one case, and they didn't have to pay any tax. There was no tax withdrawn from their monthly salaries. Well, long story short, that didn't work. The accounting department came to me one day and said, we've got these 5 employees who are not paying any tax, who don't want to pay any tax, and now we've got one who doesn't want to submit the paperwork. He simply just doesn't want us to take any money out. What can we do about this? So that's how I got involved with it. And ultimately, all 5 of those employees were arrested. IRS prosecuted them, and they wound up in jail for several years for tax evasion. So it turned out not to be a good idea to do that. And I think eventually the attorney in Montana also suffered some consequences, like getting disbarred and a number of other things. So whether you agree with the income tax or you don't agree with the income tax, you know, my opinion is that it's your choice to believe it or not, and to comply or not. But the consequences for not complying, because it is federal law, are severe. In 1913, World War I also started, and of course that impacted everyone. That is still known to this day as the Great War. It was so horrendous in that time that, you know, thousands upon thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers, and consequently, certainly civilians, and all of the people who volunteered to be ambulance drivers and doctors on the front, on the war front. You know, there were many, many casualties. And people said, this will never happen again. This is such a traumatic event that it will simply never, ever happen again. We will not allow it to happen again. Well, of course we know, and we'll get to that. We did wind up having a Second World War. But World War I was the event that, in many ways, was the precipitating factor for all of the economic depression that ultimately occurred. The war was over, I believe, in 1919, and the US in 1921 had the worst depression in US history. None of the history books ever really talk about it. It just sort of gets passed over somehow, mainly because I think it doesn't suit the agenda that the government and certain factions in the financial community want everyone to believe. But it was much worse, quite frankly, than the crash of 1929. But here's the key element. That crash in 1921, the market corrected itself. There was no government intervention. There was no government bailout. The government did not step in and bail out private companies or bail out the banks or any of the other things that have been going on worldwide since 2007 and 8. The market, left alone, literally corrected itself. It lasted about a year, maybe a little longer than a year, and the market totally corrected. In 1929, we had another depression, and that was called the Great Depression. And that impacted everybody worldwide. It wasn't just in the United States at that point. Because of the depression in 1929 and because of the financial hardships that caused, in the United States, private ownership of gold became illegal. The government literally, gold had been valued, I believe, at about $20 an ounce up until 1933. So the government bought out private citizens, bought the gold from them for $20 an ounce, and immediately turned around and revalued gold at $35 an ounce, which meant that all the people who had been forced to sell their gold sold it at a huge loss. Let's go on now to 1944. Obviously, a lot of things happen in between these years. And if you're really a history buff and love studying all of that, which I have to say is absolutely fascinating, then you might want to read some of the books on the book list that I'll send to Bill that he can post. But in 1944, the banking trust once again decided that it was time to have a meeting. So they met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And it was the banking trust and owners of the Federal Reserve, obviously, because all of the owners of the Federal Reserve were actually part of the banking trust. But by this time, the banking trust had become much larger, because by this time, it included the Rothschilds and a number of European families who were major banking families in other countries. And so all of those people were invited to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Why have the meeting? What was the purpose of the meeting? It was basically to design a plan for an entirely new monetary system, not just in the US, but worldwide. And that's how the Mandrake system spread worldwide. Because at that point, when I say to you that the Mandrake system spread, at that point, the Federal Reserve was only in the United States. So it was the central bank in the United States. But because of the Bretton Woods Agreement, that central banking system, which had created the Mandrake system, in other words, printing money and lending it to the government, that system went worldwide, because then every country, every major country, had to number one, create a central bank if they didn't already have one, and had to hold US dollars in that central bank. The reason for that was because at the time, the US dollar was backed by gold, literally backed by gold in Fort Knox. The central bank in the US, of course, the Federal Reserve, spread across the United States, because I think there are now 12 or 13 Federal Reserve banks across the US, all of which have holdings of gold in some denomination, precious metals in some denomination, gold. So it made sense in 1944 that all central banks around the world would hold US dollars, because US dollars was tantamount to holding gold in your reserve. In 1965, certain things started to happen. In the US, the silver content in our coinage, because up until that time, silver coins in the US had about 90% silver. They had some alloy, but they were about 90% silver. So when people say to you, I'm collecting junk silver as one of my strategies for hedging against whatever's going to happen with the economy and currency, the reason that they're holding on to junk silver is because it had such a high silver content. And so its value is much higher than silver coins today. Because in 1965, when the coinage was reduced in silver content, it went down to about 40% or less than 40%, which meant that the value of the coin itself was no longer as high, obviously. So collecting today's coins doesn't have the same impact on a hedge strategy as collecting coins that were minted before 1965. 6 years after the silver was reduced in the coinage, President Nixon in the United States took our monetary system off of the gold standard. Because up until that time, as I said, US dollars were backed by gold. And what that literally meant was that any central bank around the world holding US dollars could come to the US and say, we want to exchange our dollars for gold. And the US would go into the gold treasury and take out the gold and exchange the dollars for literally gold. Well, that became a problem, as you might imagine. Just like a run on the bank, there had been created a run on the US gold supply. So the US said, okay, we're going off of the gold standard. And that had many, many ramifications. I mean, ramifications that we are still feeling in our economy today in the US. But at that point, money became a debt and not an asset. As long as the US dollar was backed by gold, it was definitely an asset because you could convert it into gold. But once it was no longer backed by debt, it was simply a piece of paper. And if you've heard the expression, the good faith and credit of the US government, for example, or of any government, because to my knowledge today, there is no currency that is backed by any kind of precious metal that has any kind of value. So what we've got worldwide today is literally fiat currency, which means that it's a paper promise It's simply a promise by the government, whatever government that happens to be, that they will make good on the value of whatever paper currency you're holding. If it's a $1 or $100 or $500 or $1,000 bill, that they'll make good on that value, that the government will make good on that value. So money has no value except to the extent that debt exists. It took me a long time, a number of years ago, to wrap my head around the concept of how money has no value except to the extent that debt exists. So I'm going to throw that phrase out to you. If you've not thought about it before, then I want you to start thinking about it now. because that's the situation that we're in worldwide. The Federal Reserve, or the central bank of any country, prints money out of nowhere on the good faith and credit that the government will make that paper value whatever the dollar amount or French franc or whatever it happens to be, English pound or whatever it is. You know, at one time we had pound sterling. We don't even have that anymore. So whatever the currency is that the government will make good on the amount of whatever the paper says, that is a debt system. If the debt is paid in full, if A equals B, then B equals C, then money has no value at all. So if there is no debt, if central banks and the Federal Reserve don't continue to print money out of thin air, then, and all of that, the national debt, which in the US is literally trillions and trillions of dollars at this point, if all of that were to get paid off, then money would have no value at all, because money has no value. It's not backed by anything. It's only backed by a promise to pay. It's a promissory note. Okay, now that I've gotten through that, whether we like to hear that previous discussion or not, it is the truth. So let's move on to 1985, because now that gets us into a whole new realm of currency. The internet was created. And I guess there's some discussion about whether it was 1985 or some other year, but we're just going to use 1985 as a benchmark. And that brought in the age of electronic money. Now the game changes. It took a long time for the game to actually change, to become apparent to most people. But the changing of the game occurred when the internet was created and started to become something really big in our lives. So if we go on moving forward, because a lot happened obviously from 1985 to 2000. And actually, if you look at the 1990s, the decade of the 1990s, that was probably one of the most stable monetary decades in the history of the world. Obviously, countries go up and down in terms of economics. That's true of every country. In the US, the 1990s decade was a decade of lots of prosperity, lots of financial prosperity. Japan had been experiencing some financial problems in 1999, 2000, and in March of 2001, the Bank of Japan adopted quantitative easing. That really was not apparent to most people. Certainly, I think it was very apparent to people in the financial community who that was their job, to pay attention to what was happening to central banks around the world. And it was on the news here in the United States. I remember hearing it on the news. It wasn't necessarily a big news item. And I don't think that most people, certainly in this country, even worried about it. I don't think that people in other countries really worried about it, unless they were connected to the central bank in their country or into the banking community. But that's the very first time that there was quantitative easing in any kind of major way. If you then go from 2001 when Japan went through that whole period, the Japanese stock market crashed, and that had major ramifications. The Bank of Japan started quantitative easing. All of that started building up to the global financial crisis, which occurred in 2007 and 2008. And if you've heard the phrase derivatives, I like to analogize that to kind of a cut and dice, a slice and dice system. Lehman Brothers collapsed, which, of course, Lehman Brothers were among the banking trust in the US, owners of the Federal Reserve. So how in the world could Lehman Brothers collapse? I mean, that was a major, major event. Right behind them, Bear Stearns collapsed, another major trading house on Wall Street. So all of a sudden, things are starting to go under quickly in a rather accelerated way, which put a shock into the whole Wall Street milieu of, okay, what's happening here? Well, what had been happening for quite some time was that all of these trading houses were buying what we call derivatives. They were buying mortgage-backed securities. And that was fine. There's nothing wrong with a mortgage-backed security. You buy the mortgage-backed security, it happens all the time. People take out mortgages on their homes. Those mortgages get sold by the bank to somebody else at a discount. So, for example, if I buy a house, probably within anywhere from 1 to 6 months, because it happens now very quickly, the bank doesn't hold on to that mortgage. The bank wants its money now so that it can continue to make loans to other people. And it can't do that if it's got all of its money tied up in these mortgages. So the bank sells that mortgage, in this country, to organizations like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or Countryside or a number of other companies that were set up to buy these mortgages, most of which are now non-existent. They've all just about collapsed. But they buy the mortgage at a discount, so they pay the bank for a discounted amount of money on the mortgage. So your mortgage now, you get a slip in the mail and it says, okay, you're no longer on your coupon to make your payment, or your website to go to now to make your mortgage payment. You no longer pay the bank your mortgage payment. You now pay somebody else your mortgage payment. And then maybe 6 months later, or maybe a year, you get another letter in the mail that says, oh, well, your mortgage has been sold again. So the first company that bought your mortgage now wants its money because it wants to buy more mortgages from the bank. So it sells it to another buyer, whoever that happens to be. So this is how derivatives are born, because every time those mortgages get sold, they get sold in packages. Okay, if you can create a visual image in your mind. So the first company, and let's just call it Countryside, because that happened to be one of the big companies in the US at the time. Let's just say Countryside bought the mortgage from the bank. So Countryside packages all those mortgages that they've bought from all these different banks, and they sell that package to somebody else at a discounted price. So Countryside gets the money back, which it can then invest in more mortgages from the banks. And that third company, you've got the bank, you've got Countryside, then you've got this third party that has now bought a package. Well, that package can probably still be appraised at a certain value. But as it goes on, because those packages, and this is why I call it being sliced and diced, those packages get cut apart and put back together and cut apart and put back together in various packages, not the same package every time, but different packages. And so all those packages are now starting to get sold around the world because banks in Europe are now starting to buy these packages of mortgage-backed securities. So that's how a derivative is created. You've got all of these packages of mortgage-backed securities, which after a long enough period of time, you cannot value, you cannot appraise it, because nobody knows at that point what mortgages are included in what packages and what the value of that mortgage, any individual mortgage, may still have. So you've got all these packages of derivatives that are being sold all around the world. And that's how we got into a situation of a worldwide monetary collapse or financial collapse, was because it wasn't just relegated to the United States. Every country was doing it. Every country was buying everybody else's packages of mortgage-backed securities that no longer had any value. So 2008 hit. And in November of 2008, the Federal Reserve in the United States began the first quantitative easing. And the Federal Reserve spent $600 billion as part of that quantitative easing of buying mortgage-backed securities. They bought other stuff as well, and they created hundreds of billions of dollars in printed money. Actually, the Federal Reserve peaked its spending at 2.1 trillion. Look at the screen, trillion with a T, in June of 2010. So that quantitative easing went on for 2 years, okay? If by June of 2010 they had spent 2.1 trillion, then that had been going on for quite some time. It went on for about 17 months because the Federal Reserve was purchasing treasuries, they were purchasing mortgages and other securities in an effort to put money into the economy. So they injected about 2.1 trillion into the economy, and it lasted for 17 months. That's a lot of money to print out of nowhere. Not only did they print all of that, but they bailed out private companies, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. Now, why the Federal Reserve in the United States is bailing out private companies in Europe is still an open discussion. That's still a question for debate, but it happened. Instead of bailing out US companies, which they did to a certain extent, but they bailed out companies like McDonald's, for example. I'm still waiting on a really clear and concise explanation why McDonald's Corporation needed to be bailed out. Except that there was a loophole, and McDonald's and other companies, not just McDonald's, but other Fortune 500 companies who got in on the deal, figured out how to get money on the bailout. And so they did. By 2009, Bitcoin was created. And that really opened up a whole world of what ifs in the currency market. In 2009, the Bank of England purchased billions of pounds in assets. And then that was by September in 2009. And by October of 2009, the Bank of England had purchased billions more in assets. So it's not just the United States that's involved in quantitative easing. European Central Bank, the European Central Bank specifically focused on buying covered bonds, but by that time, central banks in other countries were now starting to look at, because now we're up to 2010, and so the US is starting on quantitative easing number 2, which started out with another $600 billion in Treasury securities. And then on top of that, later in 2010, another $250 billion to $300 billion in more Treasuries. And that quantitative easing lasted from November 2010 to June of 2011. So while it was relatively short in time span compared to QE1, if you go back and look at the amount of money, it's getting right up there to about $1 trillion plus. People say, and as far as I could determine in my research, quantitative easing number 3 in the US started somewhere around September of 2012. And the thing that is so interesting about QE3 is that the Federal Reserve obligated itself to spend $40 billion a month. So it was on a monthly basis as opposed to a total figure or an annual figure. So now they've got a $40 billion a month commitment, which is open-ended, to buy bonds and to buy mortgage-backed securities. And by open-ended, I mean that it was for an indefinite period of time with no limit at all on how much to purchase. So that is still going on to some degree. I don't think that the government acknowledges that necessarily anymore. But again, according to my research, that appears to be what is still happening, because nobody has ever called an end to QE3. So as far as we know, it's still ongoing, which was exactly what the president said, the president at the time. That's exactly what the president and the chairman of the Fed said was going to happen. In 2015, European central banks expanded the asset purchase program. The European Central Bank explicitly, and other central banks around Europe. And that expansion amounted to buying 60 billion euros per month of euro area bonds. Because remember, a bond is nothing more than a debt. A bond has to be sold to somebody. It either has to be sold to the government, whatever government that is, whether it's the US government, the US Treasury, or a foreign government. So in order for that bond to have any value, it has to be sold because it's a debt instrument. debt, D-E-B-T, not D-E-A-D. So if you're selling that much, who's buying them? Who's buying all those bonds? In the United States, other countries have been the predominant purchasers, China in particular, have been the predominant purchasers of US bonds. The US Treasury has bought some, but mainly other countries have bought US bonds. Well, in 2015, Sweden launched its own quantitative easing in February of that year, announcing that the government bond purchases would be almost 1.2 billion US dollars. In 2018, Japan, Switzerland, and Denmark, and Sweden, and the European Central Bank announced negative interest rates. So now we have a whole new animal or a whole new concept that's never been part of the equation, certainly not as far as the consuming public is concerned prior to this time. The World Bank was talking about negative interest rates for a number of years, and nothing really ever happened. So I don't think people really took it seriously. I don't think people, certainly not your everyday working person, I don't think that the average person thought that that was something that would befall them and their bank accounts. But all of a sudden, we've got 5 countries in 2018, well, 5 including the European Central Bank, who have now got negative interest rates. And what does that mean? Well, it means that when you put your money in that bank, whatever bank that is, when you put your money in that bank, you are literally paying the bank to hold your money. Because if you want to take your money out of the bank, you don't get what you put in. You don't get the same amount that you put in, you get less than. So you have just paid the bank to store your money there for X period of time. That's the simplistic explanation of what a negative interest rate is. Obviously, there are far more complicated definitions of it, but to put it in just plain, simple language, that's what a negative interest rate amounts to. That's the net effect of what an negative interest rate is concerning the money that all of us put into the bank. We don't make any money on it. We haven't been really making any money on deposits to the bank in years, in a number of years, not since QE1 started. 0.05%. You know, at the end of every year, when I have to gather all of my tax information together to give it to my certified public accountant to do my taxes, and the bank sends me a statement that says you have 12 cents interest for the year. And I just look at that and crack up laughing. Okay, 12 cents. Boy, that was a bonanza of a year that I earned 12 cents on the money I had in the bank. So it's been a problem for a long time, and we're all aware of that. We're certainly all aware of the fact that the other thing that has happened very recently, and I don't have a slide for it, but we're all aware that the banks in Greece closed. Cyprus had problems. Cyprus had been having problems for a long time. And then it became really apparent. And then we had the bailouts in Greece. And the sad part about that is that the bailouts, yes, the World Bank did loan some money. So yes, there was a debt there to the World Bank. But the other part of it was that the money that was frozen in people's bank accounts became the property of the bank. And I suggest to you that wherever you live, whatever country you live in, you start reading with great care the notices that the banks send to you in your bank statement or that they post on their websites. Because once you deposit money into the bank, it's no longer your money. And we literally in the United States have case law. In other words, courts, including the US Supreme Court, have ruled on lawsuits that have been filed against financial institutions and banking institutions, where the banks and the financial institutions took the money, because obviously when you put your money into a bank, the bank uses that money to invest. They loan money out on mortgages, obviously, but they also create a portfolio of investments for the bank with that money, which earns money for the banks. Well, many, many times, all of these banks were buying all of these derivative packages of mortgage-backed securities that had no value. So the reason that the banks had to be bailed out was because they literally made negligent and very poor decisions about what they invested their depositors' money in. And in some cases, after they lost all that money, certain depositors, very large depositors, sued those financial institutions and lost, unfortunately, because the courts held in this country that those dollars that were invested, and whether or not they were invested wisely or poorly, no longer were owned by the depositors, that they were owned by the bank, and the bank could do whatever it wanted to with that money. So if you read the fine print in your banking contracts, when you sign documents to open a bank account, 99.9%, and I say that as a lawyer, 99.9% of the people who open bank accounts or who open brokerage accounts of any kind never read the paperwork. They just sign on the dotted line. They have no clue what those documents say. Well, those documents say quite clearly in the fine print that the money is no longer yours. So I would suggest in your spare time, especially if you're an insomniac and you can't sleep in the middle of the night, that you get one of those documents out and read it for your own benefit and find out exactly what you signed up for. Because if they lose your money, it's just too bad. And if they freeze your money and take your money to bail themselves out because they've made bad investment decisions, that's also too bad. And it's too bad for you because your money's gone. So I hate to be the purveyor of sad news, but that truly is the situation. So let's talk about the Mandrake system just very shortly, because my time is literally running out here, or maybe it has. Well, it's already run out 4 minutes ago. So I want to just tell you very quickly so that you have a little bit better idea of what the Mandrake system is and how many is created. And please keep in mind that, again, this is Carolita's very simplified version of how this happens. If you take the 700 billion, that was the bailout amount originally of the Federal Reserve in the United States. So if you just take that 700 billion as the example, here's how the process goes. The US Congress, for example, passes legislation to fund that bailout, okay? To say, yes, we're going to do the bailout. And Congress says to the US Treasury, okay, give $700 billion to fund the bailout. Well, the US Treasury looks at its balance sheet and says, oh, there's a problem here. We don't have $700 billion. So the US Treasury goes to the Federal Reserve and says, can you print up $700 billion in new cash? So the Fed says, okay. They print the money up, they create bonds, and they say, we have bonds to sell, right? Because they're debt instruments, because the money is printed out of thin air. It's not backed by anything. It's simply a promissory note. And that's what a bond is. It's a promissory note. It's a debt. So someone has to buy those bonds. You know, whether it's China buying US bonds or some other country buying US bonds, somebody has to buy those bonds. So the money has to come from somewhere. And as long as the country or the US Treasury buying those bonds continue to hold on to those bonds, then the Federal Reserve gets the $700 billion, gives it to the US Treasury, and the US Treasury bails out the banks and private corporations and whatever else they do with that money. And the next time that they need more money for bailout, the whole process continues. Well, this happens in central banks around the world because, as I said, once after the Bretton Woods Agreement, and once central banks were created around the world, and all of those central banks had to hold US dollars because at the time US dollars were backed by gold. So now this whole system is around the world. So every central bank now creates money. They create bonds, they sell the bonds, they give it to the treasury of the company, of the country that they're in, and that's how bailouts occur. So that's the simplistic idea of how the Mandrake system works in every country. And if you look at what happened with QE1, QE2, and QE3 just in the decade from 2008 to 2018, the Federal Reserve in the US, their balance sheet increased 5 times. And from what we understand from announcements that have been made, the Fed is planning to do the same thing over the next X number of years. We're not sure exactly what that time period is, but over the next few years, the same thing will happen again. It will increase another 5 times. Well, here's the question for you, for all of us. Me, Bill, Claudia, all of us, because it affects everybody worldwide. How do all these quantitative easings affect us? How does it affect the world financial scenes? And why? Why should we be concerned about it? And that's what we're going to cover in part 2. Because obviously it has a major impact on us. So really and truly, how concerned do we need to be? Some people are more concerned, some are less. But we really need to take a look at that. So that's what we're going to talk about next time in part 2. Bill, thank you so much. I think we'll conclude for today. And I so appreciate this opportunity.
Well, Carolina, we certainly appreciate you. That was a lot of research got into that, and you can see the last 110 years of monetary history and the effects upon humanity is quite significant. And I suppose listening to you, I have quite a bit of knowledge in the monetary history, but listening to dating back to 1913, I suppose this is where the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and I appreciate you sending that through. And if anyone would like to have that, maybe we can put it up on our Utopian Global Facebook page and be able to download it from there possibly. But it'll give you great insights into the monetary system. But it was also the same year the taxation system was derived, because I suppose, you know, the Federal Reserve, being a private institution, knew the governments weren't good. They're good at spending, but not good at paying their bills. So they made the taxpayer bill become the actual, I suppose, one sense, the guarantors of paying the interest on the loans to the bonds. Would that be right, Carolina?
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, and the U.S. government is only paying interest at this point. Obviously, the U.S. government does not have the wherewithal financially to even pay back any on the principal. So they're barely making interest payments.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive economic cycle we're in right now, because I think interest payments alone on the US debt's probably $600 or $700 billion a year. Just imagine what you could do to the infrastructure in the US, building bridges, hospitals, schools, looking after the war veterans better. All these types of things you could do with $600 billion, and it's just being used in interest. But this is what happens, of course, when you actually outsource the monetary system to a private sector. I mean, before 1913, you said that it was actually the government which represents the people. It actually printed the money, and therefore they wouldn't have to pay interest on it. Correct?
That's correct. Yes.
So I mean, it's the perfect Ponzi scheme, and that it still exists after 100 years. It's quite incredible. It's not just the US, of course. It's European Central Bank, and you spoke also about, throughout the presentation, about the quantitative easing, and that's the expansion of the monetary supply. And of course, when you expand the monetary supply in the same amount of goods and services, because the world economy does not have much growth, it's slowed down. Of course, the cost of living increases, doesn't it? Our purchasing power dramatically decreases in the currency. So these are the things that affect us. And I suppose the last big point that really came out from your presentation is, when you put your money in the bank, it's no longer your money. I mean, most people don't realize that, and it's actually a scary thought. But I know I do a lot of international banking. But if you go and try to do an international transfer today, it's like going to a dentist and getting a tooth extracted. It is not a pleasurable experience. I mean, the questions they ask you, this and that, the documentation you want. I mean, and you realize it's not your money by the questions that they actually ask you. And I mean, I just know people who try and send money to us at times, the difficulties they have. So this is the environment we're living in right now. And of course, then you spoke about bail-ins, which really were the foundation of the Cyprus experiment, where when governments and banks are in financial problems, of course, they take the money, they can take it directly out of your account, and you have no real say about that. And that's what happened in Cyprus. And I know in Australia they passed law in Parliament through one of the most quiet parliamentary days. Not many people were in attendance. They didn't advertise it, and they passed the law in Australia. So if you do your research in your country, you'll find you probably have a bail-in law, but you didn't even know it existed. So this is what we're dealing with today. And I suppose my last point is, Carolina, and I know you're a great advocate for this, you create your wealth by earning real assets, real tangible assets, and also assets that actually generate income for you over long periods of time. But the assets must be hard assets, tangible assets, measurable assets, and that's where you get, of course, gold and silver as an insurance policy, natural resources, of course, businesses, real estate, all these types of things. So thank you for your great presentation. This, part 2 is going to be very exciting, Carolina.
Well, thank you, Bill. And yes, you're right. I totally agree with you about the hard assets. It's critical. It's critical for all of us.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for everyone taking the time. It's been a long call, but very, very informative. And you can see that the monetary system is by design. It's not a conspiracy, it is a reality. By design, it is designed to transfer wealth away from you back to the central banking system. That is just the way it is. Once you realize that, of course, it means that you've got to start to be a contrarian thinker and start to understand what the process is so you can make better decisions. But once again, Carolina, thank you so much. Good night to everyone, and thank you for joining us on this great call, and we look forward to seeing you on the next Money Matters call.